The Camaros, the Firebirds.
I had my Firebird out tonight.
There's tremendous cars.
Yeah, I had my Firebird out tonight.
When is that? Is that Friday night?
Saturday's a big one.
Saturday?
We're at,
Downtown, the whole down, they'll be last year like
Is
300 cars.
that the early
Have to work it
morning?
again.
Part of that problem with him is not him, it's him.
Yeah, you gotta be all day, well, like.
It is all
9:30
day.
Or something.
It is, yeah.
Do we have to do to make sure they get
Warm was supposed to.
Huh?
Gonna be warm.
Well, I think the city's putting tents up, they're going air conditioning. That's what I heard.
I'll be under a tent.
Right.
Jeff, the city air conditioning car show this year?
Is that yes?
I think it was a yes. At least be us a tent that goes, covers the whole downtown.
Just get one of those water bottles with a fan. I am bringing that.
You do like they do in Vegas.
Dome, control environment.
Spray water on everybody, Mike. Do them sprinkler systems.
Those Mr. things?
Yeah, that'd be good. You'd have guys swinging at you, getting their cars all soaked.
Oh, yeah.
I see there's a chance of rain, that kind of thing.
Want to be hot, you want to clean.
Just drink water.
I'll get that motion for the hand meeting next week, or in 2 weeks. I'll solicit that motion.
Okay.
Mr. Helper.
I done.
So when you retired?
Beginning underway in 10
Officially
seconds.
retired?
9, 8, 7. Good evening, and welcome to the Defiance City Council meeting for this evening, August 24th, 2021. Before we get underway, Pastor Mick Sobiak is here to open us up in prayer. Welcome this evening, Pastor Sobiak.
Thank you. Could you join me while I open in prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come before you. And Lord, as a group, we lift up our nation at this point. We pray for those Americans and others that are trapped in the nation of Afghanistan right now. Lord, we ask that you would give our leadership ingenuity and innovation so that those people could be brought home to safety and safely. And then, Father, as we gather here together, we thank you for this opportunity to come before you in prayer, to lift up the business of this city. We pray for each individual man and woman that is involved in decision-making for our city, Lord. We thank you for the blessings of living in such a fertile and industrious land here in Defiance, Ohio. And we thank you for all the blessings of the men and women that abide in this community. We pray for these leaders as they gather to conduct the business and discuss situations, Lord, that you would give them your wisdom, your peace, and your guidance and blessing on all that they do for the benefit of this community. Make them wise and fruitful servants. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service to Defiance.
Thank you.
I'd like to call this meeting to order. Let the record show that all the members of council are present. Would you stand with me for the pledge? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I reviewed the index minutes for the city council meetings of July 27th and August 10th. Do we have a motion to correct or amend either of these index minutes? With no motion, I'll sign the same. Do we have any comments from council this evening? Mr. Wexler?
Yeah, I had a couple phone calls this a little bit ago here about the water running across Karn Street. I called Rob, and he said they're working on it in the morning, coming out of north and south in the Piggly parking lot now. So, just in case anyone wonders, it's being addressed.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, Mrs. Crutch?
Yes, with school starting, just to remind people to slow down on the roads. I know there's a lot of speeding going on different roadways, so just kind of watch Jefferson, Wayne, Carnes, a lot of those that people don't notice the children as they're waiting for the buses. And also, the last meeting I had with the DDBB, they gave out the new brochures about Defiance, Ohio, so everybody has one at your seat. And then there's some extra ones if you want to take them and pass them out to other people. So that's it.
Thank you.
Brochure is well done.
It is a very nice brochure.
Mr. Corbett?
Thank you, sir. I just want to take a minute to say thank you to Melinda and the city of Defiance for the time they spent, the money they spent on Ginner to fix some of those bad holes. Appreciate that. I am going to ask though, has anybody contacted the Defiance Township because their side bites?
We are meeting with them right now.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's very unsafe on that side of the road right now.
Give us a little time, it will get fixed.
Thank you.
Any other comments from council? Right. On my desk, I have an application for a new liquor license. Bob Evans Restaurants LLC, doing business as Bob Evans Restaurant at 1835 North Clinton Street and here in Defiance. It's a new application. Do we have a motion for hearing?
Bob Evans have liquor.
It's 2021, Mr. Waxman.
Yes.
All right, with no motion. Mayor McKeon.
Thank you, President McMaster. Mrs. Crutch mentioned slowing down for our schools and all, which is a fair segue into whatever day last week school started. I believe it was Wednesday.
Correct.
I think unbeknownst to all of us, maybe Mr. Leonard had a little bit of knowledge. We've been awfully busy, probably have thought of everything, but when that happens around here, what I see is somebody does think of it. And I just want to commend both police and fire on the first day of classes for Defiance City Schools. We had fire trucks, we had police cars, we had firefighters. We had banners reminding folks to slow down, and we deserve no credit for that. But our police and fire sure do, and I just wanted to say something. That's all I have, sir.
Well,
Thank you.
Mr. Leonard.
Just one item, and it's an expenditure of money in the amount of $16,517 to Ventura LLC, and the description is for Bronson Park path equipment. That's it.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would, as an administrative representative, request a motion for a special meeting pursuant to Rule 3.1 at our next meeting on Tuesday, September 7th. That would be actually before our next meeting. The special meeting would take place at 5 p.m. Under our proposal, and the subject matter would be the now city property located at 629 Arabella Street. And we would hear a presentation from Mr. Jason Hammond of Hammond Consulting. And we want to have a special meeting so that members of the public could attend and ask questions. But we would also have time to conduct the regular council meeting at 7 p.m.
Okay. So do we have a motion for a special meeting on September 7th at 5 o'clock in order to meet with Jason Hammond?
So moved.
Mr. Engel? Second. Mr. Waxler?
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch? Yes.
Okay. That's September 7th at 5 o'clock. This should be an interesting meeting.
And I would ask for a motion to hold an executive session to consider the purchase of property for public purposes. Ohio Revised Code, Section 121.22 G2.
All right. Do we have a motion for an executive session this evening?
So moved.
Mr. Mast?
Second.
Second, Mr. Hancock?
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch? Yes.
And Mr. President, I would ask for a motion to hold an executive session to consider confidential information related to the marketing plans, specific business strategy, production techniques, trade secrets, or personal financial statements of an applicant for economic development assistance, where such information is directly related to a request for economic development assistance that involves public infrastructure improvements directly related to that project. Ohio Revised Code, Section 121.22 G8.
And do we have a motion for a second executive session, Mr. Waxler? A second?
Second.
Mr. Mast?
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
All right. And we'll have a second executive session as well after legislation this evening.
That's all I have.
That's all you have. Thank you. And Mr. Leonard?
I have nothing at this time.
Thank you. Before we get down to our legislation this evening, we do have a couple special guests. Melinda Sproul is here this evening to discuss the South Clinton Street sidewalk replacement and the Cleveland-Ottawa Roundabout project.
But I think Adam McDowell is going to go first.
Sure. Mr. McDowell, you're here to discuss the GAC project update? Sure. Glad to have you here, thanks.
I just want to give a brief update on what's going on. A lot of you have seen the tanks have been delivered now. If you've driven out by the site, they're very impressive. I mean, what looked like a really big building now has gotten a lot smaller whenever you take out all the floor space. We're tracking a little bit behind schedule. COVID has really disrupted supply chains. So we are pushing a little bit further back on construction than what we expected to be. Originally, we were supposed to be starting in early January, and that was when we were supposed to start up. We're looking now probably the middle of February. That still falls into our compliance dates with the EPA, but it is tracking a little bit behind schedule. Contractors are having a lot of trouble getting, especially large diameter piping. So they're constantly waiting for something to come in. Right now, some of the big things that we're looking to get still is the pre-engineered metal building that will cover it all up most of it's gonna be built, and then the building's gonna get built over top of it. But we're looking at probably October, November, when that building will come on site and start being constructed. It should be finished before probably middle of December. And the electrical system with the new generator, the pad mount transformer, the electric service will be also done probably in November. So whole construction should be wrapping up about May or June of next year. So I don't know if you have any questions. It's really cool. If you haven't been out there, by there, and you see it, just even if anybody wants to come and take a look at it as it's being constructed. Typically, the contractors are out of there about 3 o'clock. So if you want to stop by and give me a call in advance, we wouldn't have to worry about being in anybody's way. But it is an interesting build. And if you go out there, there's a lot of underground work that's been done, a lot of large diameter work. Some of the things we were concerned about originally, like the large diameter tie-ins going to the clear well, a lot of those have been done. They were very successful. And Peterson, the contractor that's been working on it, has done a really good job. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you much. And secondly, Melinda Sproul to discuss the South Clinton Street sidewalk replacement and the Cleveland-Ottawa Roundabout project.
Let's do the roundabout first, Melinda, that'll be quick.
Yeah, that one should be quick. So the update on the Roundabout project is they have all of the underground utilities, water, sanitary, most of the storm installed. So now they are starting at the north end to cut the roadway to rebuild the entire roadway, and then they'll start on the roundabout. They are tracking on schedule. The last schedule update I had was that they would do signage at the end of September. So they'll meet their 90-day road closure for the contract. We think we have the maintenance of traffic taken care of for the most part. So, any questions?
The roundabout itself, is that gonna be multiple lanes?
No, single lane.
Single lane, other than the turn?
It's just single lane.
Okay.
And I think Mrs. Sproul wouldn't hurt to mention that the center is gonna be a solid concrete so that oversized loads can,
Yeah, so we have, as you know, we have a lot of oversized special loads that come through that intersection, and we designed it such that they could maneuver across the roundabout. The signposts will be such that they can remove those and then traverse through if needed.
I was out there walking around looking at your right, and there's orange stripes, like probably from me to you from Speed's front door. Is that where the road's gonna be?
Without looking, no, that close?
Yeah.
That's not where the road's.
Okay, okay.
That's probably where they have marked out, if it's orange lines, that's usually a utility marking
Okay.
for telecommunications.
Cause I was looking at the stripes going across this bar and I'm thinking,
Yeah,
holy cow, you can't, it's only him walking out the door there, okay?
correct me if I'm wrong, Melinda, with the property acquisition, Speeds was the least amount of ground of the four corners.
I don't think-
yeah, that's probably true. We paid the most in the property acquisition for costs to remedy the access.
But he's gotta have paved around the building now to go around it, right? I mean,
He
that was-
does have to
yeah,
do that. He was given, as part of the
Yeah.
acquisition, he was given that as part of the cost.
Yeah, I just,
Sure.
it threw me off when I seen them orange lines up thinking, boy, I hope it ain't that close, so, alright.
Well, as you mentioned, the single lane roundabout, it'll be very similar to Palmer.
Woodhurst.
I'm sorry, not Palmer, but Jefferson.
It'll be very similar to the Palmer Woodhurst roundabout. It will not have the right slip lane
Correct.
the Jefferson Palmer has.
Thank you.
Mr. Corbett?
Well, you talked about getting oversized loads through there and having to remove, I'm assuming some sort of posting or gate. Who's gonna be responsible to do that when are they gonna have to let the city know so they get out there?
They're supposed to come to us for permits when an oversized load comes through. A lot of
Does that
times
ever
they
happen?
don't. It does happen, not as frequently as we would like it to happen. But we did during the design phase have a lot of interaction with the special haulers that would be bringing loads through, so they're fully aware of what we are trying to allow them to do. So hopefully we get notified so that our guys could do it. If not, I guess their spotters will do it and then put them back as soon as they're
I didn't know
through.
if we're having any involvement from our people. I know that when, the time when we did it at our company, that the city end of it was usually the part you didn't know for sure. The state doesn't necessarily tell you that each town you go to requires a permit or not. That's not their problem, so.
And we are listed on ODOT's website for special haulers.
Okay.
They should know that they need a special permit, but
What's the speed approach, coming from the south to the, roundabout?
the speed limit's 35. But as you get into the roundabout or close to the roundabout, we designed it such that you'd have to slow down to about 20 once you enter it and go through. But the regulatory speed limit's not changing.
So there's a sign there saying 20 once you get close.
No, because it's not a regulatory speed limit. It's designed, the geometry of it is designed such that you feel like you have to slow down to make it through.
I know the one over on 6 or you see where trucks drive over it quite often, I mean, the one.
Which is a high speed.
It's right in the middle of the
approach,
highway, yeah, and I
right.
mean, they miss it and go through it all the time over there, so.
True.
Will there be any signage then that'll say welcome to Defiance, or nothing will be in that center since the oversized loads are?
There won't be anything in the center.
Statue of the mayor holding up the sign.
I think that would be nice.
We talked about a couple sleeves with a sign that could be lifted in and out, because those signs really aren't that heavy. But to keep it simple, and we'll do something at that part of town. Let's get the roundabout built and regroup.
So basically, we can't have the signage because of the oversized loads, basically.
That's right.
Has ODOT ever decided about maybe having them go a different route, like on 108 and go all the way to Napoleon to hit 24?
ODOT's gonna do what ODOT's gonna do, I'll tell you that. That's,
Yeah.
you can't tell them anything.
Whenever we get a
Well-
permit, they tell us what we're doing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mr.
This has probably been talked about before, but what about pedestrian crossing at the roundabout?
So part of the project that we're doing, there's actually two projects that are going on in that corridor. The second one hasn't started yet, but we're including multi-use paths along Ottawa from Greenbrier, which would be Spring Meadows, manufactured home community, and it would extend north pretty much to Agnes. And then, we have the sidewalk that's going along Cleveland from the roundabout west to meet up with Evan Drive, so that would be completed. The crossings at the roundabout would be identical to the way that you cross at the either Jefferson Palmer or Palmer Letters, so those will be marked.
Is your question who has the right of way? Is that what you're asking? Pedestrians or cars?
Okay.
Well, you're supposed to stop whenever you see a pedestrian enter the roadway.
I know what you're
so.
supposed to do, but I know
Right.
what they do.
There won't be signals or special.
But when I went on vacation where we were
RFPs.
at, what I saw was a button somebody slapped and these lights start flashing and you stop. That's the way it is, but.
And we do have those at other locations. This is not a location that it's really needed, just because of the slow movement, hopefully slow
There's a lot
movement
of
of the
kids,
traffic.
we hope they learn how to walk to school. That's
Trucks,
trucks going through there,
big thing.
yeah.
And we have that already at Jefferson, because people are going across maybe to Cabin Fever or.
This is a little out of town traffic. It's probably drives a little bit different.
So we'll see how it goes.
Hopefully
Nobody got
not.
hit yet, so. It's usually when we find out we were wrong.
And Melinda, the completion date that we have projected with the 90-day window, what date is that?
The 90-day window is around September 30th.
Okay.
And then they have until the end of October to clean up.
Finalize.
Yes. The one thing that will be pushed beyond that because of industry delays is the lighting that's gonna go up in the roundabout. But we anticipated that during design and wrote the contract such that they have to provide temporary lighting. If you remember, the
They did that
Jefferson,
on
Palmer,
Jefferson, yeah.
and roundabout had the same provision, so it'll look just like that. They'll have a light plant there for 2 months, maybe 3 months, until they can get the light poles in.
Mayor McCann, the center decor of the roundabout, from the presentations that we had here from the students, are any of those things going to be put in place?
On Jefferson and Palmer you're talking about, or on Ottawa
Ottawa.
Avenue?
Or is it Jefferson? Where was that?
Jefferson's where the kids
Okay,
are from.
all right.
Yeah, the kids did Jefferson.
Okay. never
And
mind.
And
again,
Whitehurst.
we chose not to do Ottawa because we don't think we can really put anything in the middle other than the required signs.
Okay.
But you'll hear more about Palmer and Jefferson come budget time.
Okay.
Any other questions in these regards?
Well, on to South Clinton Street, sidewalks. If you recall, in 2019, Maumee Valley Planning started developing for the county an active transportation plan. I think that was brought up several times here. Maybe we were asking for some additional project listings, of projects that the community wanted to see in the active transportation plan. They actually held a public meeting at the library, I believe it was held at the library here in Defiance. And then they had one in Hicksville also, where they were soliciting concerns, needs, missing gaps, and projects. The South Clinton Street project is identified in our active transportation plan. Shortly after that was adopted by the commissioners, we spoke to ODOT about applying for Safe Routes to School funding, specifically for the South Clinton Street project. And after we did the interviews, questionnaires, and other outreach that's required through Holy Cross, it was determined that that project would not qualify for the program. So just a little bit of history as to where we've been trying to get some funding for this project. Most recently, we developed a cost estimate, a conceptual cost estimate for a 5-foot wide sidewalk on the east side of South Clinton Street, currently where it exists now. And that number was, for construction, about 200,000. I think you have some follow-up information on cost allocations, if we want to go there next.
I don't know if we do wanna go there next, but for the time being, yeah, $200,000 construction estimate. Engineering, maybe some of the oddball things. I mean, I had run some numbers on a $250,000 project. As with every discussion we have regarding sidewalks and a lot of other public infrastructure that benefits private property owners in one way or another, we always get hung up on who pays, on who's paying for the work to be done. There's plenty to talk about and debate on whether the city pays for the full cost of a project like this, or whether the property owners are responsible, or whether there is a mechanism for sharing the cost. And so I have some estimates in place based on like a 50-50 split or a 2/3, 1/3 split, where the city would pick up half the cost or 2/3 of the cost or the full cost. Obviously, if it's full cost, we're paying, say, $250,000, the homeowners wouldn't have any responsibility at all. If we choose to assess a portion of the project, we've had conversations here, it would likely be a 10-year assessment. We could, as we've done in the past, because of the lower cost of this one, we probably would not have to borrow money. So we could do an assessment that would be interest-free. Those folks would pay the basically the principal amount of their obligation over a 10-year period without any interest charges accruing, if we go that route. One of the concepts that we had talked about, and maybe I think, Joe, you might have been part of the conversation, the last assessment we did for properties was a sewer project in the Ayersville Avenue area. It was a part of land outside the city. We annexed the city in, absorbed them into the city's sewer system, and then installed the mainline sewers down Ayersville and several other roads, Stanley and a couple others, Dahoney, I believe. That was a very expensive project. And the details at this point, no sense in rehashing that, but the property owners were in full agreement as to what the assessment was going to be. But what we did there is we capped the amount that the property owner would be liable for. So, there are many ways you can approach a cost sharing effort if that's the desire. We had kicked out, if you capped the homeowner's share at $2,500, I think that was actually to have a 50-50 split on the $250,000 would be about a $3,000 cap per property, based on approximately 40 properties on the east side of the street. A scenario where we would cap the property owner's liability at $2,000 would be the 2/3, 1/3 split. The city would pick up 2/3 of the cost, the property owners pick up 1/3. That would cost each property owner approximately $2,000. Again, over a 10-year period, $200 a year on the property tax bill. It's just examples, just hypotheticals of possible scenarios and how to fund it.
A quick question, but the cost on this, is it gonna be greater because of the fact that we're not just replacing in kind, we're gonna have to make improvements and move it, so, this isn't like we're just going in and laying concrete.
Right.
So there's gonna be a greater cost because of that.
Excuse me.
Remove the old sidewalk,
Yeah.
grading along the
Graded.
street.
Correct.
So if a homeowner were there now and they were gonna redo their sidewalk, would they be able to just put it back right where it is?
Where it is now?
Mhm.
Actually, we recently did that as part of a
One.
sewer project, wasn't it?
It was a necessary project
Right.
because of a sewer repair.
Right.
And there was no other choice for us but to put it back where it was, or it wouldn't connect.
Yeah.
To the rest of it.
Right, understood. But that's what I'm saying, nobody's ever replaced one since it's always been there. But now if they're gonna replace it, we're gonna have to move it and.
So I think
guess-
For safety
what
reasons.
we're looking for, guidance from council obviously is this a project we should pursue? I think we all agree it does, or it is. What would the cost sharing be? And, we would look to complete this in 2022. Mr. Rusty wisely suggested that we have a town hall meeting and invite the folks that are impacted by this project in June. And obviously, we want to get that scheduled fairly soon, before the holidays. So they're up to speed on what the plan is.
Mr. Rusty?
Yeah, the total cost of the project, I think initially, the figures that I had heard was $400,000. So the only thing I didn't know was how many properties there were involved on the east side. But, we're looking at, a reduced amount about 250 for the total project.
That would be the more recent
Yeah,
estimate.
so
yes.
even on 250, like half of that, half the 250 in regards to cost sharing, whether it's a 50-50 split, probably because the total project is a lot less than what originally I thought it would be. It'd be probably maybe closer to a 75-25% split. And then see how that works out in regards to the cost to the homeowners over a 10-year period of time. I don't have a calculator, but I think, the math on that, we pay half and the cumulative homeowners pay the other half. We could be generous and pay the whole cost. And I don't know if that's what we want to do, because this isn't something, as was mentioned just a little bit ago, that just came about just recently. This is something that was prevalent pretty much in the 60s and before. And we're just now at this point trying to say that because of connectivity issues to the splash pad and Bronson Park and safety issues, potentials, and whether it's something that we just need to fix, something that we just need to do, move it along, get it done. And I guess I'm inclined to basically the 75-25, but I guess I'm always one of those persons that would like to say, let's share in the total, because in essence, we do have other projects that we need to do. But I'd like to hear what council has to say on that.
Well, I don't have a calculator either. And usually when I do math in here, I embarrass myself, but if.
Yeah, that's why I didn't do it.
If 3,000 is a 50 split, then half of the 3,000 would be 1,500.
About 1,500.
And so that's over 10 years, that's $150 per year per property owner, $75 a half. So that's where we would be with that, Mr. Rusty, if we went 75-25.
It's a lot cheaper than what we initially thought about, more so to a 250 mark if we dealt with the larger figures and the numbers. So I guess that's where I would like to go with the funding portion of it, but I guess I'm inclined to hear what other members of council have to say.
Mr. Waxler?
I know what you're saying, I agree to a point, but the other side of that is we created the issue. They had their sidewalks where they need to be, and the city or the state, whoever, I'm sure the city had to have some kind of involvement in when the state was redoing that road and widening it and covering the sidewalk. So in my point of view, we created the monster. I think the city should pay to do it. That's my opinion.
If you want to take responsibility for what ODOT did, okay.
Well, the administration had to allow something to go on. You can't tell me that we had no clue that they were covering the sidewalk every time I widened that road. Or if it did, we weren't on top of things. My opinion is we pay for the sidewalk and get it done. So that's just my opinion.
I'm sensing a couple of things. I think the grade level of South Clinton has risen. It's been raised, and the sidewalk is lower, so we're gonna have a grading issue. If ODOT could grind about 1.5 feet off of that down, it would be level with the sidewalk.
That ain't gonna happen.
All the way down through there.
They won't do that.
I
They've got a
understand.
base there and they like
I
their
understand.
bases.
The other thing that comes into mind, experiences, me as a resident, when we did our sewer laterals, years ago, there was a $2,500 limitation, I believe. And if you went above that 25, it was the homeowners, and then that 25 was the limit of who we wanted to have contracted to run that lateral. I kind of like the idea, but I also side with what Mr. Waxler mentioned, is that, yeah, ODOT has created most of this as far as the grade level. But I also, as a citizen, I also feel that we need to help each other out. So as for a full cost, maybe 50, yes, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, somewhere in there is a possibility as well.
I'm not doing that math.
But
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Realtor.
Okay,
Will moving these sidewalks over do anything for the value of those homes?
I think so. And also improve our quality of life. I mean, I see a lot more activity of people walking, riding bikes. The reservoir is a great example. We have a lot of activity out there. This would connect the splash pad, Bronson Park, with those individuals that would live north of the Riverside Cemetery. I could go to Eric's, get me some ice cream, and walk it off to the splash pad. As well, I mean, that's just, but I also feel that there's other locations within the city that we need to work with, but let's start with one and then progress to other areas. That's just how I'm feeling right now, so. Thank you.
Mr. Waxman?
You know, the other thing we created out there, if you go out there and look, especially in the winter, when there's a lot of snow and they plowed off the road, all them people's driveways are full of water. I mean, I know some of them's actually put drains in their driveways, you know? So I'm just saying if we should just pay for it and put it in, and then the grade, you're obviously gonna have the right drainage at that time under the sidewalk. So we're gonna eliminate a lot of problems by doing this. So, I don't know.
We discussed the drainage. I don't know how much this project's gonna have either a positive or negative impact on the drainage as it is. We didn't do elevation shots, Mr. Waxler, but if you stand there and look at it, and looks can be deceiving.
Right.
It frankly appears to us that the water runs off the roadway or across the sidewalk, as you mentioned, and then it collects right there towards the end of the people's driveway.
It does if they have stone driveway, but if they got concrete, it runs down.
But then if you look back closer to the homes, it appears, and I just want to say again, looks can be as deceiving, that the grade goes towards the homes. Which is counterintuitive. You probably wouldn't build a home today where the grading sloped back towards the house, but that's the way it looks.
I agree with that.
So putting a sidewalk, excuse me, Mr. McMaster, putting a sidewalk back at the edge of the right-of-way isn't really gonna improve the drainage one way or the other.
Right, but it's gonna improve the safety, and that's what I'm at.
No disagreement. There's no disagreement here at all. What we've gotta come to a conclusion, we've had 3 opinions, is how we're gonna pay for it.
Mr. Mast?
Just real quick, I think one of the more important points that I've seen brought up on this is that this is a major walking thoroughfare. I mean, this is something that is gonna be an improvement for the entire community. For biking, for jogging, for walking, which speaks to the city paying maybe the lion's share on something like this. And even if we can get like a 75-25 or whatever, a little bit of something, but for the most part, it is, I think, something that's important and beneficial for everybody. And my only other question was how far back into people's property lines will this put the sidewalk due to the right of way? I mean,
Well, so for right now, we would look at offsetting this replacement sidewalk the same as, if you're familiar with the current sidewalk that's along Riverside Cemetery. That one is about 12 feet off the edge of pavement, so we would probably offset this one about the same.
We go too much further and we start to impact quite a few trees.
Right.
And also, you have a grass area between,
Yes,
or curb, or.
it would be grass.
We can plant some trees for Rob to water.
There's a lot of utilities in that corridor.
Soak up that water.
Mr. Corbett?
I guess if we're rendering opinions, I might agree with Mr. Mass, because if this is a quality of life, which it will be, that's something we're trying to develop here in Defiance with more walkability. I see no difference between paying for that as the upgrades to all the park systems we're doing now. That's all quality of life to make it a better place to live. So I might be inclined to just foot the bill on this one and move forward.
Okay. Mr. Engel?
Yeah, I could, look at this, maybe even look at a 50-50 split, or even with Mr. Aresti going with a 75-25. But my understanding, when this sidewalk was first put in, there was probably 3 to 5 insurance companies that put money to this to build that sidewalk. And I have heard that, and I heard that pretty straight, but I mean, it wasn't the city to put money into that, it was the insurance company, 3 or 5 of them that put money into that to build that sidewalk. So, yeah.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes, I think, Mr. Corbett, you're right about these quality of life issues. I think just to make sure that council's aware, in the active transportation plan, there were a series of sidewalks that was noted in the plan. I'll just read you a couple, because right now you have a lot of people walking on the road. And when you talk about those quality of life issues, you really should be talking about whether or not we want them walking on sidewalks or shared use path, those kind of things, because it can be dangerous to walk on certain roads. So the plan itself calls for looking at sidewalks, for example, on Ottawa Avenue, a multi-use trail and sidewalks. We are trying to leverage grant money for that. Okay, it'll be a second phase of the revitalization from what we've already done down Carnes Avenue. So there are funding sources for some of these programs. Ayersville Avenue is something that, I mean, you probably never considered to have, an area for sidewalks, but something that should be at least looked at. Jackson Street sidewalk improvements, Downs Street sidewalk improvements, Ralston Avenue, we should finish that at least all the way down to the hospital. North Clinton Street, Latch Hall Drive is something that could be considered as well. These are all part of the active transportation programs and the strategies that we use. Ginner Road, shared use path down Ginner Road. I know that the street and the road needs repair, but at the same time, we shouldn't forget about some of those connectivity pieces that we want to create destination points to, and sidewalks would certainly be a way to get there. Stadium Drive, Carpenter Road. I see a lot of people walking on Carpenter Road. And it would be nice just to have these shared use paths or sidewalks. So just to keep in mind that there are other sidewalks, East Second Street, we've talked a little bit about, but keep in mind that we should be looking at, from a strategic standpoint, the entire infrastructure, not just one. But I think you're right about this street. I mean, we've had numerous discussions about South Clinton Street being in a park, being in a school, being at the splash park. I mean, obviously we should address the situation. It's been talked about long enough.
Mrs. Crutch?
I kind of go back and forth between some of the issues. I remember back in the 80s when my first home that we purchased, the city said we had to fix our sidewalk and we had to foot the bill. And being newly married, we had no money, so we had to take out a loan. So I can see the point of us taking care of our own sidewalks, but I also like the idea of a 10-year possibility of helping some of those people that may need help to purchase the sidewalks. I also like the idea that we should foot the bill because I understand that the road is high and, you know, maybe we should have checked that out with ODOT at the time and we didn't do it as a city and proposed then that we should have done the sidewalks at that time when the road was being done. But I like the 75-25. I think that would be a fair way of doing it. I think citizens wouldn't be so bad as far as to help with their own sidewalks. But also a town meeting is where we're really gonna hear some of the facts of what these people have decided on their properties. You know, I would love to see the sidewalk being there, and I would love to see trees along there too, but I understand with power lines, but I don't know, it's kind of a hard situation because as a city, we wanna be fiscally responsible with our money. And I understand the connectivity of the sidewalk, of getting it all the way down to the splash pad, and we're trying to try to promote healthy living and better living, so we do need that sidewalk there for the connectivity, I get that.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell?
Yes, just for council's information, one thing that Mrs. Crutch raised about the 1980s, getting married and paying for the sidewalk. Our current code was passed in October of 1980, and it could be modernized if you're thinking the city would pick up some of the share, because what the council at the time just figured was that everybody was going to pay for their own sidewalks, and it's very rigid, very black and white. So given how this discussion is going tonight, I could see where I might need to come back to you with some minor changes, some tweaks to the code, maybe an addition or two, to give you that flexibility to pick up some or all of the cost share of this sidewalk, if that's the direction you choose to go. The other thing is, if you choose to go for a partial assessment, we still have to follow the same procedure as if we did 100% cost of assessment. So you would see that legislation coming before you in the next few meetings as well.
I think we've got different opinions here, obviously, which is fine, that's what we're here for, but I think maybe we need to get the people involved, and that'd be our first step, then we really know what we wanna do with this project, so. I mean, if they're all.
We've had a lot of success with town hall meetings.
Right, so
There can be.
but I don't wanna drag it out, it's a safety
Modest
issue, and I
matter.
wanted to address, so I think it's something that we need to get set up and do.
Once Labor Day's passed, Mr. Waxer, fun's over and it's time to think about picking up
That's right.
leaves.
That's right, there you go.
So,
Mr. Esty?
Other than the funding portion of it, I think it's, we know what the overall cost is gonna be. So the question comes down to it is that if we said it was a 75-25 split, even if that was the thing that we decided here tonight on a motion in regards to the project, that can always be changed. And it could be as a result of the meetings, if we go through that while this is pending. I'd like to go through 3 readings if we do approve this tonight to go forward. And, we can always let the people tell us what they think, which would be the important part to it.
One thing I would want to add for the sake of the timing discussion and all that, there are numerous requirements we would have to go through. There won't be legislation coming in the next few weeks. There's got to be regardless of the town hall, there has to be public hearings with regard to the assessment. There's calculations that have to be done. We've got to come up with a fair way to equitably allocate the assessment if we go that route. When we did the last assessment, we had outside legal counsel draft all of this for us. Our revised code, there's some pretty strict hoops you have to go through to do an assessment like this. So I don't want anyone to be under the misinterpretation that we can have this in a few weeks or even take a motion tonight. I don't think you can do anything like that. There's got to be steps you've got to go through to meet the letter of the law. That's all.
How do you go forward?
Well, we can pursue that avenue. I mean, from I mean, right now, we're probably talking about a 2022 project anyway. I don't even think it can physically be done in the current year. There's time as far as that goes. It can certainly be done in conjunction with preparing the 22 budget and our talks in the fall, have all those meetings put in place. And quite honestly, between Sean and myself, we'd probably reach out to the same law firm, Squires, who did the Earsville sewer assessment for us. If it's something we thought we could do in-house, that'd be fine, but I know they're awfully cautious about how you go about an assessment, and we usually would, heed their advice.
So would they, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So with the issue today, if there's interest, do you need direction from council to say, to promote those expenditures, to get those people in place and do those things?
Well, so two things. One, if this is a $250,000 project and we're going to include it in the 2022 budget, regardless of how it's funded, for the time being, I'll answer that in a second, but regardless of how it's funded, it'll go in the capital budget like any other project. What I'm hearing here tonight is that a whole lot of support for the city paying for the whole thing or most of it. Maybe we don't even, maybe we don't go through the hoops of having the assessment done. And then what you'd have to weigh in the fall is a $250,000 sidewalk project, maybe putting off a portion of a street resurfacing. I mean, there isn't an unlimited amount of funds. So, but if this is the priority, and it clearly is, and I think with good justification, it just rises to the list and something falls off the bottom of the list, that's all. But I'm hearing a lot of support for the city paying for it, or at least paying a majority of it. Quite honestly, it's a small enough project, and if the city's gonna pay 75%, maybe we eliminate all the legal fees and all that kind of stuff, and we just pay for it.
Okay, I'll take that. So if that would be a recommendation from the administration, I would say let's go forward with it and eliminates that problem that we are.
I know I sound like I'm drinking, but it's just water.
No, but there is validity in that, because in essence of a lot of the steps that take place, and how much would it cost for us to do a lot of those things, that if we eliminated all that, we just went straight forward and put the car in the garage and then that was it.
Earsville Sewer was a multi-million-dollar project, and it made a lot of sense to pay for that legal counsel, and it might not on a $250,000.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Corbett?
I appreciate Joe, he's thinking, but maybe the first step is to ask the administration to send the letters out to the 40 residents that are involved and get them here so we can begin to understand what they have concern-wise and what their thoughts may be. I still believe this is a quality of life issue in this instance, and we should just go ahead and get it done. I agree with that, Joe. And I also agree with that's a cost savings there. That's part of that $250,000 estimate that you wouldn't have to spend on legal fees. But maybe we should just start with getting the residents' opinions.
We can arrange for a town hall. I agree the meeting could be here. And I believe we do owe it to them to share with them just where this sidewalk's gonna go on their property. It's gonna be closer than what it is now. And this isn't a project for this year. We don't need legislation. As Mr. Leonard says, we can deal with this come budget time. But we can have all the town halls in preparation for that in case something comes up that we haven't anticipated.
I think pick a date and we'll be here.
Yeah.
The only legislation, again, we might need is changing some of these shalls in the code to a may, and giving you the flexibility to pay for that entire sidewalk.
But I think the town hall is coming before that, or no?
No.
Might as well make the change.
In conjunction with the budget, do we wanna just focus on just South Clinton, or should we focus on another area at the same time, like Mr. Leonard said?
I'd like to see how South Clinton Street goes.
Okay, cause we're in budget too.
If I can not retract, but just back up a minute. You know, I think Jeff's point and the point of a lot of discussions we've had is that what we do with South Clinton ought to be consistent with a long-term strategy, and we don't yet have the long-term strategy. I tend to agree that this is, if you're gonna categorize roads by quiet residential versus busy thoroughfare versus connectors, if you're gonna categorize every street in the city that way, I think this would fall into the one that says, this is in the city's interest and we would pay for it. But you're setting a precedent. We set precedent with practically everything we do, but we might be setting a precedent. We ought to be thinking, does this fit into what we'd like to see in a long-term strategy?
Mr. Engel.
Melinda, I got one question. The $200 to $250,000 estimate that we got, when was that done? Just lately?
Yeah, recently.
Okay. Reason
Within the last month.
I ask that, because if this is not gonna be a 2022 budget, I think we maybe need to get another one, get that more update and get all of our ducks in a row before we go forward and do anything. We'll say the city pays 50%, 75%, but I just think we need to watch what we do. And like Mr. Leonard said, set a precedence to do this. Also, I agree with Mr. Corbett. We just need to do what we gotta do and do it all the same instead of doing it, the city pays for this, then the next one we do, residents pay 50%. That will not go over good.
Mr. Waxman?
No,
I'm good. Sorry about that. Mr. Mast?
I just want to say I agree with what the mayor said and Mr. Corbett, Mr. Waxer, is regardless of who's paying for this, we definitely need some town halls, because this isn't something we just want to dump in people's laps and right on their front lawns. So I think some input was going to be really important for us to get from them, regardless of who's covering the price tag. But also at the same time, I think Sean's right that we need to have something in place here, because moving forward, how are we going to, we need something to encourage sidewalks to be repaired one way or another. If it's somehow to set a precedent that if we have an application process for some sort of program to get an assessment on your taxes, if you can do that individually, something like that, just to encourage sidewalks to get done, because too often they don't. So.
I think before, I'm sorry, the last follow-up on what I was saying. I think before we just start changing shalls to mays, we ought to define the discretion that we'll use to say who's a may and who's a shall. I mean, those things should be defined in a strategy before we just change the code to say may. We ought to define what the discretion is that we're trying to establish. Just not getting the cart before the horse. You ought to have the strategy of who's going to pay for which streets in place before we just say, because who's to say, well, we may pay for this one, we may not pay for that one, without any definition of how we're going to make that decision.
Mr. Waxler?
That's what I was gonna say. Are we gonna decide what we're changing before we take off here? That's exactly what I was gonna say, so.
Mrs. Crutch?
So it's basically looking at the plan of the city streets and deciding which ones are more connectivity type sidewalks compared to just a little side street. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah.
I can see that. But I know when I go back to the 1980s, my sidewalk was a main thoroughway on Wayne Avenue by the schools going back and forth. I had to pay for it myself, so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Don't live there anymore.
And that, none of that needs to hold up the South Clinton action.
Right, exactly.
But it ought to be worked on at the same time.
Yeah, and I understand, and more of those streets that you were talking about are more of those connectivity type
Correct.
sidewalks that we're thinking of.
You've already had subdivisions that never put sidewalks in.
Correct.
So.
Mr. Esty?
Changes to the code would be, would that be, an administrative meeting that we have coming up, or would that be a future streets and sidewalk meeting as a whole that we would have to basically discuss those potential changes as we've discussed, whether we're gonna deal with corridors, master sidewalk plans and or whatever. Would that fall under that part of it? How would the administration like to address that?
Well, you certainly could hold a study session, and I think that's kind of what I'm hearing is we want to determine what the thoroughfares are and what are the side streets, Mrs. Crush. And I think you need to, once you make that determination, we can talk about putting language in that gives you the discretion to throw in some city funding into these projects.
And if we went that route, how long would it take for the administration to basically make those suggestions to us for the changes based on our input?
Well, there's only about seven or eight code sections that I'd have to go through. Maybe add another one at the end.
Some of the strategy we might be talking about is already in the 2019 plan. It's just a matter of revisiting that, maybe updating it, having a conversation with you all, coming to agreement as to what roads are defined what ways, and go from there.
Yeah, so like I said, could it be put in any time sooner? I think I'm hearing that we want to proceed with that part as soon as possible. Maybe even in conjunction with any meetings that we have coming up with the public. But, next couple of weeks, 3 weeks.
We're buried right now, Mr. Uresti. For us to plan for anything, draw up maps, give you our opinions, meet internally, meet externally, you gotta give us some time.
That's what I'm saying.
We'll talk about it maybe in the executive sessions.
Okay,
Okay?
it's good. That's all I have.
Yes, we will.
Okay.
Any further questions, any further direction? Mr. Hancock?
Melinda, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we do have 4 items of legislation for discussion this evening. Ms. Elders?
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing the purchase of real property located at 631 Riverside Avenue and declaring an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to discuss the next 2 ordinances in tandem for the sake of brevity. But again, like the 116, 118 Seneca Street property that you approved the acquisition for a couple weeks ago. These are 2 properties that are in the 100-year flood zone that the city administration is proposing to acquire using both FEMA and OEMA funding. The cost sharing would be the same as the prior acquisitions. That 87.5% would come from the state and the feds, and then we would pay the remaining 12.5. So the purchase price for the 631 Riverside Avenue is $52,000, and then the 731 Riverside Avenue is $105,000. And part of the reason that's higher is the 731 Riverside Avenue actually includes 3 parcels, 2 in the back there by the river. And according to the purchase agreement, the city pays for the conveyance fee, the deed package, and the title commitment, again, using part FEMA and OEMA funding for that. And your approval authorizes the city administrator to go ahead and enter into those purchase agreements and close on these properties.
Great. Thank you. Do we have questions for Mr. O'Donnell? Mr. Hancock?
I also noticed that the acreage is just over 6 acres for all 3 parcels. Thank you.
Mr. Corbett?
If there's no further questions, motion to suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call. Second, Mrs. Crutch.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And we have a motion.
Motion
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Engel.
Second.
Second, Mr. Hancock.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
This ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing the purchase of real property located at 731 Riverside Avenue and declaring an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
And I stand by what I said in the prior comments.
Mr.
If
Corbett.
there's no further questions, motion to suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call. Second, Mr. Mass.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And we have a
Motion
motion to adopt. Motion to adopt, Mr. Mass. Second, Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance directing the city administrator to apply for a grant from the Ohio Public Works Commission to assist with roadways improvements and pedestrian bike facilities along Ginner Road between State Route 66 and Carter Road and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you. Some of you are bringing up the roadway conditions along Ginner Road, and part of which is in the city and part of which is in the Defiance Township. I'm not sure the exact breakdown, but we're glad that, we're happy to report that we would like to pursue some Ohio Public Works Commission funding to resurface that road. And that cost estimate is $550,000. And the OPWC funding is a proposed $275,000. The city hopes to partner with the Defiance Township to apply for that grant. And in fact, Ms. Brow was meeting with the Defiance Township trustees on going forward from their end. This obviously gives council approval to pursue it, but how did your meeting go?
They voted to pass a resolution in support of the project. So what will happen is this will be our application with a joint cooperative agreement with the township trustees. And part of the project, it won't just be resurfacing, the roadway is in too bad of shape. So it's gonna be reconstructed, kind of like if you all remember what we did on Agnes. It was kind of chewed up and then cement was added to it, a new base put down, and then asphalt was laid on top of that. That's what's gonna happen. Part of our proposal was to include a multi-use path along this corridor as well. And the project wouldn't happen until '23. We apply in September of this year. The grant agreements are released in July, which is a terrible time to bid a project and start a roadway construction project. So it would be for a '23 construction year.
So yeah, if we get it, we would split that cost with the local government, and we would have it budgeted for you to approve at that time.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to clarify for council and the public that, so the folks understand that we're talking about the segment of Ginter from Jefferson to the curve where you would then turn east to Carter. It stops at the curve. It's just Ginter. It's not Carter. I want to make sure everybody understands that, so when the time comes, why didn't you do Carter? It wasn't part of this project. Future projects possibly, not this project.
Mr. Waxler.
So if we apply for the if we get to 275, then the balance of that is that balance of the 550 split between us and the township?
Yes.
Is that like
Essentially, it's about a 60-40 split. We'll end up paying half of the 275, basically, is the way that our share is looking at right now.
okay, so we get
Because we're applying
275
for-
and then we split 275? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. That's the way the numbers are working right now.
Okay. I didn't know
Close
what
to that.
part the township was actually,
Right.
okay.
Do we have any other questions? Mr. Corbett.
No, sir, this is a much needed project and I look forward to starting it. So if there's no other questions, I motion to suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call, Mr. Corbett. Second, Mr. Waxler.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And we have a motion to adopt, Mr. Mass.
Motion to adopt.
Second, Mr. Waxler.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
This ordinance is also adopted. And lastly,
First reading by caption only, a resolution accepting the amounts and rates and determined by the Budget Commission and authorizing the necessary tax levies and certifying them to the county auditor.
Mr. Leonard.
Yes, thank you. Each year we see this resolution come before you. The County Budget Commission certifies the property tax levy rates and estimate of what those revenues will be for the upcoming year. And they ask that the city council pass the resolution accepting those amounts and rates. The rates are unchanged and have been unchanged for years. The amounts that we would anticipate the city to receive off property taxes slightly increased over the prior year, and that's typical.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard? Mr. Waxler?
No further questions, motion to suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call.
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes. Motion to adopt?
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Crutch. Second, Mr. Hancock.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And this resolution is adopted. Right. With that, any citizens' concerns before we take a break and enter executive sessions? All right, without any, let's take a few minutes, stretch our legs, and then we have 2 executive sessions to address this evening.